So now we're going to look at labor demand, an intro to it at least. The full discussion is going to be discussed in a later lecture. So there's a couple things to look at when you're looking at labor demand. The first is the actual demand schedule. And the demand schedule says that at different wages, how much labor is demanded. And if we look over here, so let's say we have different levels of wages. Now remember, this comes from the employer side, okay, the employer side. And let's say that at $10, the demand for labor was, let's say, 100. And so what's going to happen is that as the wage goes up, then you're going to see the demand for labor go down. We'll talk why that is in a second. And so let's say it goes to 80, 60, 40, 20, and then 0. Okay, so this is going to be your labor demand. And so here we have the demand schedule, which is that relationship, and here we have the demand curve, which is the actual graphical representation of it. Now, if you notice there, the demand curve was going down. And there's two reasons for this downward sloping labor demand curve. And remember, it's the firms that demand labor. So let's look at why that is. Now, there's two important terms that I'm going to discuss here that are going to be discussed in a lot of detail at different points throughout this course. So it's very, very important to look at it and understand it. So I'm going to go through it step by step. The first is the scale effect. And we're going to be looking at this in terms of wages going up. So if we go back here, you see that as wages go up, the demand, quantity demanded of labor, the desired employment, goes down. So wages go up, desired employment goes down. And so if we look here, there's a couple steps in this. So first, wages go up. So as wages go up, production costs are going to go up as well. So it becomes more expensive to produce the goods. Okay, and that's just basic microeconomics 101. Now, as the price of the good goes up, let me phrase it. As the production costs go up, it causes the price of the goods to go up. All right. Now, why is that? If you think back to your, again, your basic economics courses, if you have your price, these are for the actual products, and quantity, you have your demand for the goods, and the supply. And remember, the supply is measured by the marginal cost. So if wages go up, it becomes more expensive to produce. The marginal cost goes up. And so what's going to happen is that that supply curve is going to shift to the right. And with equilibrium, we're going to go from our original point to our new. And so the price of the good, oops, did not mean to do that. Let me go back here. Oops, so the price of the good is going to go up, and the quantity demanded is going to go down. And so let me get this back up here. There we go. So again, so wages go up, it costs, the production cost goes up, which drives up the price and down the quantity demanded of the good. So there's less units of the good that are demanded. All right, so this is the product. Well, what happens then is that there's less demand for the goods. All right, well, if you're not producing as much of the product, then you're not going to need as many people to produce it, and so that causes the quantity demanded of labor to go down. So that causes, and so that's where you see that downward sloping line. The other effect, so that's a scale effect. It's called a scale effect because it affects how much of the good is produced. The substitution effect factors in the other ways to produce the good. So, as I discussed earlier, as you can produce a good using either labor or capital. And so labor is the human aspect, capital is the machine aspect. And so if you think about car production, so if you ever visit a car plant, you'll see the labor and you'll see the capital. You see the machines putting some of it and you'll see the people. Okay. Now we'll talk about this more in labor demand, the separate chapter. But what happens is as wages go up, in relative terms, it's becoming more expensive to employ labor than it is capital, relative to capital. And so L is labor, K is capital. And so because of that, you're going to say, all right, well, it's becoming now more expensive to produce labor, to use labor, so I'm going to use less labor and more capital. You're going to substitute. So in the substitution effect, wages go up, and so because of that, because now labor is now relatively more expensive, you're going to produce more capital and less labor. And so in the substitution effect, as wages go up, the quantity demanded of labor goes down. And so this just shows through the scale and the substitution effect why the labor demand, or as wages go up, the quantity demanded of labor goes down. Now, that labor demand, it just shows you the relationship between the wage and the quantity demanded, just like with any demand. Okay, it's just a relationship between the two. This graph is showing, it says basically the only thing that affects the demand for labor, quantity demand labor, is the wage. It's not the case, however. Some other things can affect how much labor is demanded. And so the main way that labor demand changes is by product demand. And so if something happens that causes demand for the product that's being produced to go up, the demand for the labor to produce it is going to go up as well, and vice versa. Now, we talked about the demand scale and substitution effects with the demand curve for labor. Well, let's talk about the demand for capital for a second. So when the price of capital changes, there's two effects. Again, the scale and the substitution. So first, if the price of capital goes up, it's going to be more expensive to produce the good. And so the price of the good goes up, quantity demand goes down. And so if the quantity demand of the good goes down, you're not going to need as much labor. And so that goes to the product demand as well. So the quantity demand of labor goes down. Okay. Or more specifically, the demand for labor would. So then you have substitution effect. So if the price of capital goes up, labor is now becoming relatively cheaper than capital. And so you're going to substitute capital for labor. So here we have two different effects happening. So if capital becomes more expensive, the scale effect is going to cause the demand for labor to go down. But the substitution effect is going to cause it to go up. Right? So you have these ambiguous effects that are going on. So if you assume that capital and labor are substitutes in production, which means that if you are using more capital to produce the same amount of the product, if you're using more capital, you use less labor and vice versa. You substitute them for each other. So if that scale effect dominates, so this is what happens if the price of capital goes up. So if the price of capital goes up, it's more expensive for the capital. The scale effect is going to push down the demand for labor, but the substitution effect is going to push up the demand for labor. If that scale effect dominates, what you're going to see is the overall demand for labor go down. If the substitution effect dominates, it's going to cause the overall demand to go up. Okay? So the overall change is going to depend on which effect dominates. Some other levels to analyze when you look at demand. So demand could be on the firm, industry, or entire labor market. So when you're talking about labor demand, the firm demand is demand for labor just by one specific firm. Okay, one firm it's the demand by a specific firm. The industry is demand of all firms in a particular industry. Okay. So all the firms in an industry, they're the ones who are demanding labor in the industry demand. Then you have the entire labor market. And so the entire labor market is for some specific type of labor. For example, machinist or a janitorial individual or an accountant. It's demand for that specific type of labor across all industries. Okay. And so that is labor demand in a nutshell, at least the introductory part.